Okay, we're going to do a bit more factoring, but recall that factoring is just the reverse of multiplication. So what I want to do is remind you how to multiply out two binomials. We did what was called the FOIL technique. It's the same as distribution. You multiply the first two terms, and then the outer two terms. You multiply the inner two terms, and you multiply the last two terms. And then what happens very often is you'll combine the two middle terms because they're like terms. You multiply two binomials, and in this case you get yourself a trinomial. So just like in the last video, sometimes you're given this polynomial right here, but what you want is the factored polynomial, the polynomial written as the multiplication of two binomials. So the question we're asking in this video is, how do we go backwards? How do we start with a trinomial that has this form right here and end up with the multiplication of two binomials? Okay, so we're starting now with x squared plus 7x plus 12. And we'd like to rewrite this thing as the multiplication of two binomials. So this is basically just a number game. We know that to get this term x squared, what has to go here and here are x and x, because those two multiply to give you x squared. You also know that whatever two numbers you have here, you're going to multiply those two together. That's going to have to give you 12. We know that in this example because this last term, this constant term, is a 12. We also know that when we multiply the outer two terms and the inner two terms together, you should get two terms, and they should combine to give you 7x. The only reason we know that is because we did it up here. We multiplied the outer two terms and the inner two terms together. We got 3x and 4x, and it gave us 7x. Well, notice what just happened here. These two numbers in this example, 4 and 3, they multiplied together to give us 12, and ultimately we added them together in these two terms to give us 7. So ultimately what we want are two numbers here and here that multiply to give you 12 and add to give you 7. So that's what we're looking for. So it does become just kind of like a numbers game. What two numbers multiply to 12 and add to 7? You just think about it for a while and you get the numbers 3 and 4. Of course, to add to 7 and to multiply to positive 12, the numbers have to be positive 3 and positive 4. Okay, let's try to play that same game again. We're going to start with the trinomial. It looks like it has the same form as the others. And we know, because of the form, that it's going to factor into two binomials. Both of those binomials are going to have an x as their first term. And we need two numbers, and they need to multiply to give us 5. And they need to add to give us 6. Okay, we don't have too many options here. How many numbers multiply to 5? Well, the only two are 5 and 1. And fortunately, those two numbers also add up to 6. So we've got our answer. We factored our trinomial, and it looks just like that right there. Now this problem pretty often brings up a question. Since 1 and 5 are the only two numbers that are going to multiply to give you 5, what would happen if your middle term wasn't 6x? So what if you had this example right here? Well, as it turns out, this trinomial cannot be factored into two binomials because there are no numbers that multiply to 5 that add to 3. My other note is that every problem in this video is going to be of this form right here, x squared plus some number x plus some other number. So in every one of these examples, this first coefficient here, the leading coefficient, is just going to be 1. We can factor many trinomials that don't start with a 1, but that process is going to be a little bit more difficult, so we're not going to talk about it until another time. Okay, now that we've made those notes, let's move on and try to do another one. This problem is x squared minus 8x plus 15. Again, it's of the appropriate form, so we know it's going to look something like this. And we want two numbers, and those numbers need to multiply to give us 15, and they need to add to negative 8. Think about that one for a minute. Well, the numbers that multiply to 15 are 3 and 5 and 1 and 15. But remember, those numbers could also both be negative, like negative 3 and negative 5, and that gives us our answer. The two numbers that multiply to positive 15 and add to negative 8 are negative 3 and negative 5. So that's how you factor. Alright, now that we've done a few examples, see if you can do a couple on your own. Here's the video quiz. You have two things to factor. Good luck!